Hi, and as I said, good afternoon. This is actually the fifth event that the Borah Symposium is holding this week. We started on Sunday with a movie and continued throughout these 2 days. So I hope you've been enjoying it, and I hope you'll continue to enjoy it with us tonight, where we hold a panel discussion with the three speakers. But this afternoon I'm here to present you Rabbi Foreman, and it is with great pleasure that I do so. I'm just going to give you a little background. Rabbi Foreman holds a Doctoral of Divinity degree from Hebrew Union College. He also received his rabbinic ordination and MA degrees from Hebrew Union College and a Bachelor's of Arts from Franklin College. I'm not going to give years here. That's okay with you. He's the founder of Rabbis for Human Rights, through which we actually contacted him. And he also served as its chairperson between 1988 and 1992, and again in 2002 and 2003. He also held a number of key leadership positions during his rabbinic career, and I'm going to only name a few because they're numerous. He was the director of the Israel office of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. He was the chairperson of Interns for Peace, and then going back a little, he also joined the Freedom Riders in challenging the southern U.S.'s Jim Crow laws and the non-compliance with U.S. Supreme Court decision that prohibited segregation in all inter-public transportation facilities. More recently, Rabbi Foreman keynoted the Nobel Institute Conference on the role of religion in Middle East peacemaking. Several of his talks were featured at the United Nations conferences in Dakar, Senegal, Amman, and Jordan, as well as many other places. In 1994, Rabbi Foreman was a member of the Israeli delegation to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony for laureates Shimon Peres and the late Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. He's also the author of several books and a great speaker, as you will witness here today. So please help me welcome Rabbi Foreman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always nice to hear what your biography is in case you don't remember. By the way, I'm now retired, so my memory is a little bit shot. My father, though, had a wonderful statement. Into his 90s, he used to tell me, David, if you can't remember something, forget it. I always thought that was a... But Moran did leave out one element of my biography, and how you could overlook that is, and it's not for me to tell people to be immodest, but, it's very important to my talk, so I'll just say it. If peace breaks out in the Middle East, it'll be because of me. Now, and you overlook this. But I'll explain that bold, less than humble statement. In 1993, in the summer of 1993, this was about 6 weeks before the Oslo Accords, when there was mutual recognition between Palestinians and Israelis, was revealed to the world, and about 2 months before the famous handshake on the White House lawn under Clinton's watchful eye, the then President of the United States, between the late Yasser Arafat and the late Yitzhak Rabin. I had the great privilege to introduce the Prime Minister at an international conference in the Chagall Hall in the Knesset. Now remember, when I talk about the Oslo Accords that took place in Norway, they really provide the foundations of what came about later, the Camp David negotiations, the Clinton proposal, and what now is bandied around as the roadmap. So they have tremendous significance. So this is a true story. As we were walking from the wings of the hall into the podium for him to speak, I turned to the Prime Minister and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I hope that tomorrow's vote of no confidence in your parliament, in the Knesset, won't pass. There was going to be a vote of no confidence in his government, and if it passed, at least in Israeli parliamentary democracy, the government would fall, and there'd have to be new elections, and it was pretty close. It was teetering. Nobody knew whether indeed it would pass or not. And he turned to me in that deep, resonant voice of his, and he said, no, Rabbi Foreman, I'm afraid it will pass. And I turned to him, and I said, no way. He thought I said Norway. So when I said that it could be because of me if we... In any case, there's also out of the Oslo Accords was the great discussion that took place at Camp David. If you remember, the then Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Ehud Barak, was invited with the late Yasser Arafat, the President of the Palestinian Authority, by the then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, to come to Camp David to try to once and for all negotiate an agreement that would crown the Middle East, the Palestinians and Israelis, with peace. And Clinton was very, very eager that these talks would succeed. He wanted to do that which Jimmy Carter succeeded in brokering a peace between, as far as we Jews are concerned, the most implacable historical enemy of the Jewish people, Egypt, and with Israel. He wanted that to be his legacy, and at the time, Clinton's legacy was certainly questionable, to put it lightly. But he realized through the talks that they weren't going to succeed, and he became particularly frustrated. So according to a story that's making the rounds in diplomatic circles, the last day of the talks, he invited Arafat and Barak to his cabin for intensive negotiations, hoping to break the deadlock. But at the very end, when he realized it was just going to end in abject failure, according to the story, he turned to Barak and he turned to Arafat. In a peak of anger, he said, "I can't understand you Jews and you Muslims. Why can't you learn to live in peace like good Christians?" Northern Ireland aside. Part of the answer to that question is best posed in typical dialectic fashion that we Jews only know how to pose answers to questions, and that's with another question. And the question that should be on our agenda is, what is a Jew, and how should a Jew behave? Now, I'm going to talk from my own perspective, and I hope that what I will do is take the wonderful words of Reverend Gerber and Imam Hindi, which talked of an ideal world, and try to see it in the practical applications of everyday life. I remember I spoke to a group of ministers who had come from the Boston area, and after I finished, they said, "Rabbi Foreman, what should we tell our constituents when we return back to Boston?" I said, "Tell them it's complicated. It's a very complex and complicated situation, as a general indeed articulated for us yesterday. For clearly, regarding the question, as far as I'm concerned, what is a Jew and how should a Jew behave, we are the people that are most competent, or should be the most competent, to answer these questions. As Jews, we judge ourselves against what we believe is the Jewish value heritage, and we do not want anyone else to make presumptions on how we behave or not behave based on our sense of who we are, any more than we would presume to make assumptions on how others behave or not behave based on their moral code of conduct and faith, although admittedly in the world that we live in today, it's very hard to withhold judgments and prejudicial statements on the behaviors of others. But ultimately, we have to be answerable to ourselves. And if other people judge us, they should judge us based on a universal standard, and indeed, they might understand that perhaps they have some fingers to point in their own direction and not necessarily at other nations around the world. And therefore, you must understand there are legitimate reasons why myself and people like myself feel challenged to try to understand the way Israel behaves in the particular environment that we're living in. As for me, it's really a matter of what the face of what the Jewish civilization will look like, at least in my eyes. And I mentioned to a group of people this morning that Israel has become to the West what Switzerland is to the winter holidays. It's a moral resort area. And much of the world judges how they behave or how they act in terms of what the cradle of monotheistic religion, Judaism, what their country will look like. Now, the ultimate test of how one behaves is when you're threatened. It's very easy to hold on to your sense of moral integrity and steadfastness if you're living in peace. I mean, to be honest with you, America has a wonderful record in the protection of human rights in times of peace. Their record in times of war is not admirable, and one need not go to the internment of the Japanese during World War II. It's easy to be morally righteous if you're living in Sweden. I mean, what are you going to be morally outraged about? That your country blockaded a Norwegian fjord? I mean, it's very, very difficult. But try to hold on to your sense of moral integrity when you're afraid to get on a bus, when you're afraid to go to a restaurant, when you're afraid to go to a mall. And the harsh reality is that when you're concerned about your own sense of physical well-being, your own sense of security, certain civil liberties are sacrificed. America is dealing with this in a very dramatic way as a result of what happened in 9/11. And I can only tell you from my own personal experiences that it's very complex balancing the issues of morality and security. Holding on to the very body of an individual is critical. But how do you balance with maintaining the soul of that same person? That dialectic is very, very challenging. I know that I've worked at roadblocks in Israel, and oftentimes we're criticized, rightfully so, on some of the behavior of soldiers at roadblocks. But I can tell you this invariably, particularly when we stop ambulances. Oftentimes if you stop ambulances, and no matter how benign and pleasant you want to be, it's a violation of someone's civil liberties if you have to stop them and check them and look through their belongings. And sometimes if you stop ambulances, you can prevent them from doing something very important that can result too often in tragedies. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, without fail, invariably, 1 out of 20 ambulances were filled with arms, being ready to be transferred to someone to carry out a horrific act of terror. 1 out of 45, 50 taxi cabs were filled with Kalashnikov rifles to be transferred to someone else to carry out acts of terror. Civil liberties are necessarily sacrificed as you protect your own sense of security, but it is a very, very slippery slope. It is very easy to justify all manner of excesses and violation of basic human rights and elemental aspects of civil liberties in the name of national security. And I can only speak from my own perspective, but I'm sure there's a universal application here. As a Jew, I dare not, given what I understand as the Jewish value heritage, go down that slippery slope. And therefore, all forms of collective punishment, particularly if they have a punitive value to it, have to be avoided. And that means that you can't have extended curfews and school closing and house demolitions and excessive expropriation of lands and depriving people of their economic viability and educational possibilities and their social services and medical needs. The baby cannot be thrown out with the bathwater. It's easy to say, well, I have to defend myself, which is a legitimate right of anyone at any given time. But that legitimacy to defend oneself cannot be so abused that you wind up offending in a very grievous way those people who deserve the most elemental human rights. We have a wonderful statement within the Jewish text. It says, justice, justice you shall pursue. And our rabbis interpret that and say, why is the word justice said twice? Because a just cause must be pursued by just means. If the means become so corrupt, then the cause itself necessarily will fall by the wayside. Now, over the centuries, the Jewish moral code has been refined and elaborated in the perspective of our mundane experiences and spiritual ideals of our heritage. And our literature instructs us well in this manner. And here I refer to the literature that not only records our real existential experiences, our real drama as we develop, but also that literature that tells of our allegorical beginnings. And it was mentioned by every one of the speakers last night and also by Imam Hindi and Reverend Gerber today. All of us are created in the image of God, in the divine image. Our rabbis ask us as they try to understand the text, they say, why did God begin the world with one human being? So that no one could say that his ancestry or parentage or lineage is greater than the next person. And why from the dust of the earth? So that no one can say that he or she is made of superior stuff, and that we should understand this in terms of race. The rabbis said that God created Adam from the dust of the four corners of the earth, black soil, red loam, yellow clay, and white sand, so that no race or color of human being could say, this land, this world, does not belong to me. This universal understanding of the very allegorical, and some would claim factual, beginnings of the human race is a lens by which you can understand other texts that can be abused to justify all manner of human rights abuses. And if you start with this universal understanding that we're all created in the image of God, then you understand parochial texts that relate to whatever religious persuasion you belong to that has a concern for the other, even under the most difficult times. And I said the most difficult times is when you're threatened, when you feel that your life really is being challenged in an everyday sense. And so that literature that also records our real historical experiences also has a universal message to us. As the nascent stages of Jewish history unfold, for me, Jewish national identity was forged in our anvil of experiences as slaves in Egypt. Out of that collective suffering and disenfranchisement, we were born as a people, charged with a divine mandate to become what we say in Hebrew, a goy kadosh, a holy nation. And if anyone wants to know what a holy nation is, for us Jews in our weekly reading from Scripture, this week we will read from the book of Leviticus what it means to be a holy nation and what is called the Holiness Code, to care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger who lives with you, you shall treat as a citizen, for you were strangers in a strange land. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. I am the Lord. And this Saturday evening we'll begin the wonderful story of Passover, where we Jews celebrate that escape from freedom through the desert, where we were given this divine mandate to create a new social order that would be the rejection of the abuse of power as executed against us by the ancient pharaohs, and build that new order based on the prophetic vision of social justice and equality and decency. That major Exodus event is what defines us. Of course, there's a wonderful story I just heard the other day about a boy who comes back from religious school training, and the parents ask him, what did you learn in religious school? And the boy said, well, I learned how the Israelites got out of Egypt. And the parents said, well, tell me how it happened. He said, I want to go out and play ball. It's not that important, not a major story. And the parents said, no, you can't go out till you tell me. And the boy said, okay, what happened? The Israelites got to the Red Sea, and there was a roaring sea, and it was high, and didn't know what to do, so they built a bridge. They built a bridge out of mortar and brick and stone, which they learned how to build pyramids, and they climbed on the bridge and over the other side of the bridge. They waited for the Egyptians to come. The Egyptians got on top of the bridge. They took some TNT. They blew it up. The Egyptians fell in the water, and they all drowned. The parents were aghast. And they said, is that what your teacher told me? She said, no, but if I told you what she told me, you'd never believe it. So. But that miraculous event for us is the most defining historical event within the nature of who we are as a Jewish people, to the extent that next Saturday evening, this coming Saturday evening, we will recite the words. In every generation, a Jew is to consider as if he or she personally went out of Egypt. That we were enslaved should sensitize us 1,000 times over to persecution, not just that any other religion or nation would perpetrate against anyone else, but that we ourselves might replicate. And so therefore, it is significant that we know that the stranger who lives with us, as I said, shall be treated as a citizen. In short, we're to behave to the stranger as we would want the stranger to behave toward us. In fact, the rabbis tell us, don't judge someone else until you've been in their place. Obviously, the relevance of these principles to Israel's present political and social reality are profound. The cynic will say, in a world of suicide bombing, it's not morality that counts, but power. But ought we not respond and say, if we unleash the type of power that was used against us throughout the centuries, will we not look into the mirror and see those who haunt our worst nightmare? It's often too easy to justify an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If we believe that, the world would be blind and toothless. There has to be some sort of balance and restraint if we're to learn something from a history. But it's complicated. The balance between morality and security is very complex. Within our Jewish tradition, we have the most sacred days of our year are the 10 days of repentance, from the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, until Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And we're suspended, we say, between two books, between the book of life and the book of death. And read texts that say we have to make the choice between good and bad, right and wrong, a blessing and a curse. Life should be that simple. The truth is we all live in the gray areas. And one moral decision may have other implications that have grand immoral consequences. And to concretize what preceded me in the wonderful words of Imam Hendi and Reverend Gerber, I want to put this into a very personal and practical understanding. In 1982, there was a war with Lebanon. Whether it was justified or not is another issue altogether. The fact is I was called up and I understood the war to have some sort of justification to it only because the northern towns in Israel were being bombarded by Katyusha rockets. I was a reserve soldier in the army. We went up to a small town called Shlomi, which is next to Rosh Nikra, which is the northernest town in the western part of Israel that borders Lebanon. And this is what our commanding officer told us, a reserve soldier like myself. He said, when you cross over the Mediterranean for 12 kilometers, crossed over the border for 12 kilometers, on one side is the Mediterranean Sea, on the other side will be these banana fields. And in those banana fields will be these Palestinian operatives. This is before the mutual recognition, before Oslo, between Palestinians and Israelis. They will be darting in and out of these banana trees, but also they will be hiding behind these elderly Lebanese Christian women who are out there picking their bananas, using them as human fodder as they fire on your tanks from their shoulder-held, self-propelled grenades. And then he told us you to put your flak jackets on, your helmets, open up your tank windows, make ready your M16 semi-automatic rifle, and then came an order. Shoot first, ask questions later. Already a dilemma of incredible moral proportion. Perhaps he was trying to fire us up to go into a situation where you're frightened. I was 38 years old, 3 children at home. Not an easy reality for someone like myself. And a person who had handed in his draft card. When I lived in America during the 60s, I was faced with a whole new reality, but believed in the viability of the security for the Jewish state. We crossed over the border. It was exactly as he described it. Literally, with our binoculars and our telescopes from the tank. Literally. We could see Palestinians darting in and out of these trees, but also some of them, I'm not exaggerating, physically holding these women as human shields, firing their shoulder-held, self-propelled grenades on our tanks. And tanks don't go that fast even on an open road. For 12 kilometers, there wasn't a minute of respite as we were fired upon. Never once did anyone, at least in these 12 tanks, that's not to say what other units may have done, but at least in our 12 tanks, never once did we fire back for fear of killing somebody innocent. We got to our position upon the Beirut-Damascus highway, and it turns out that 2 of our tanks were hit. For the same reason, the people in that tank also didn't fire back. And 2 of my comrades in arms from the time I served in the Army from 1973 had been killed. Now, Amnesty International embraced me as a great moralist. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights would say I did an incredible deed. But we never told the wives the circumstances under which their husbands were killed. Maybe the moral thing would have been to shoot. How does one know in a situation like that? And even if you're in a situation where there's no collateral damage whatsoever, it's you or me. No collateral damage. You don't think about ethics. Your family dashes before your eyes. You don't want to give them up. But you don't feel any moral rectitude that you killed another person. Indeed, you wake up in the middle of the night with a horror that you did it. And if indeed you find out years later that the war was unjustified, that we returned after 18 years with our tails between our legs, then that really makes you feel terribly morally culpable. But at that particular moment, it's easy to have hindsight. To be a Monday morning quarterback, it's more difficult when you're confronted with a situation. So when Israel a year and a half ago went out on a targeted assassination and killed this Hamas terrorist by the name of Salah Shahada, the world criticized us, as did I, because 14 innocents were killed, including 3 children. But Israel's a very small country. It's very intimate. Everybody knows everybody. There simply are no secrets in Israel. Of course, I understand why very dramatically. My youngest daughter is 18 years old. She's going to be going in the Army in the fall, and because she speaks Hebrew and English fluently and as well as Arabic, she was asked if she might want to try out to be in the intelligence branch of the Army. Kid can't keep a secret. I mean, you'd say you can't have the car. She'd tell me everything. I mean, there are no secrets in Israel. And it so happens that my daughter's father-in-law was the head of the interrogation branch of Israel's Secret Service for 20 years. When they got married, I said, anything he wants is fine with me. He shouldn't break my legs. Well, he told me. He still gets intelligence briefings. And he told me, this fellow, Salih Shahada, was planning a cyanide attack in Israel. It was at the advanced stages, to the point that he had his operatives already in Tulkarm and in Kalkili, because the attack was going to take place in Hadera or Netanya. Well, suppose he had succeeded and got the materials into the hands of these people, and they carried out a terrorist attack in a mall in the north of Israel, and 100 Israelis were killed. We would have held our country morally responsible, despite the collateral damage, for not having killed him. How do you know what the balance is? It's very, very delicate. And so when 2 terrorists were picked up not more than 6 weeks ago, coming out of a small Palestinian village called Borah, which is next to Bethlehem, which borders Jerusalem, with their sword-side belts on, they had maps as to where they were going to carry out their dastardly act of terror, and it happened to be the same daughter of mine, her high school. That very afternoon, 15,000 residents of this village were placed under an open-ended, hermetically sealed curfew so the army could ferret out those people who had sent them on their dastardly way. I'm opposed to collective punishment. You know, every religious leader always models himself after someone. Imam Hindi referred a couple of times to the great Martin Luther King. So I also have my personage. Abraham, the father of monotheism, as it were, if you remember in his discussion with God about wanting to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, how can you inflict collective punishment? So I might as well model myself after Abraham. It's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. I'm opposed to it. But I certainly am not interested in someone looking just like an Israeli teenager walking into the public school and blowing herself up and himself up and killing who knows how many young people. It's a very delicate situation. Of course, then it turns out the terrorists weren't even sent from this village, but from another village entirely. So 15,000 people were placed under this curfew, collectively punished for no reason. It's a very complicated situation as you try to defend yourself and hold on to your sense of morality. Yet having said this, the Talmudic texts that suggest for the sake of a life a Jew is permitted to slay an assailant who seeks to kill him is very qualified. And those ecstatic religious Jews in Israel who use this text to justify all manner of excesses have not recognized how subjective this statement is to various interpretations. And it's important to understand that because what we have within the Middle East, I gave a talk, as Moran mentioned, about the role of religion in settling the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I said the best contribution that religion can make to solving the problems between Palestinians and Israelis is to stay as far away as possible. Because they've exacerbated the situation with rhetoric that is almost frightening. Because what we have in the Middle East is a national ego, which has been clothed in a chauvinistic theology, where divine blessing rests upon one community above the other, and everything is justified in the name of God. That fusion of religion and nationalism is a recipe for an explosion. It's what killed our Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. It has grabbed hold of too much of the Arab world. It is those same religious Jews in my own community who are opposing what could be the first step towards some sort of accommodation, the disengagement from Gaza. It's a reality that we live with, which is very difficult. And to be honest with you, I don't understand my ultra-Orthodox and ultra-fundamentalist partners. I pray from the same liturgy that they do. We pray for peace 3 times a day. At the close of the blessing, at the close of every meal, we Jews say a grace after the meal. And the closing line is, God, who gives strength, will give strength and peace to his people. And when we bury a victim of terror, we recite the mourner's prayer. The last words is, God who makes peace in the heavens will make peace on earth. I don't understand why they're not the vanguard at the front lines, leading the peace movement. Instead, what we have is this parochialism in terms of understanding text, rather this universal understanding, which therefore colors the text in a way that is far more inclusive and open. And so this text that says a Jew is allowed to rise up early to kill the assailant who comes to kill him is explained very well by the great Jewish medieval philosopher Moses Maimonides, who makes it plain that killing another in self-defense is an action that's justified only when the threat to one's own life is imminent. If it is not imminent, and sometimes it's difficult to know when it is, but if it's not imminent, and you cannot prove that's the case, and you, the presumed victim, kill the assailant, and you cannot prove in a court of law by bringing 2 witnesses in who have never spoken to each other and have to have the exact same story as to what happened, if they can't have a combined story that's equal, and you, the presumed victim, kill the assailant, then you can be held for a capital crime. And our rabbis go further and delineate that says if someone in your household is committing a transgression and you do nothing to prevent that person in your household from committing a transgression, you are held responsible for the transgressions of the entire household. And the wonderful Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel said, if we are not all guilty, we are all responsible. And Rabbis for Human Rights was created in that vacuum, and it has 100 Israeli rabbis, Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative, created in that vacuum, to give an authentic voice to Judaism that is different than the shrill voices we hear from fundamentalists, that also Americans are dealing with right now. I came here shortly after 9/11, and to be honest with you, I understand the need for such a disparate community as America to unify them at that particular moment when all of America was so traumatized by this horrific act of terrorism. I was still aghast when I went into churches or synagogues and found that the closing hymn turned out to be America the Beautiful, or God Bless America, or the peaceful national anthem about bombs bursting in air. I mean, I was aghast because there's a danger when religion and nationalism are fused together. It's a danger that sometimes has no notion of moral breaks, but unleashes acts that we know to be impossible. As a Jew, I was raised on just such a tradition, and as a rabbi, I was educated to believe that these moral principles is what guide us and characterizes a people. Therefore, you might understand how living in Israel, sometimes I feel like I'm living out a Faustian drama. Unless you misunderstand people who hold my positions, families of Holocaust victims, families who have lost other family members in wars, in terrorism, missing in action. There is an entire movement within Israel that does try to speak with a voice that is equally authentic in terms of the more shrill fundamentalist voices that we hear, not just coming out of Israel, but coming out of too much of our world today. Now, in terms of the ethical dimension of how Jews are to behave, as I said at the outset, we're the ones who ought to be best able to judge ourselves based on our Jewish value heritage. And we dare not overplay the card of comparisons. Although I would say that if we did any comparative shopping at an ethical mall, we'd find that Israel is really a pretty good country in a bad neighborhood. We're surrounded by feudal lords and religious dictatorships, military dictatorships, sheikdoms, and monarchs. And if you compare Israel's behavior to some of the more grievous acts of other countries, we don't look so bad. I can tell you this, if Israel ever waged a war in Gaza that America has waged in Fallujah and Najaf, if we ever passed anything approximating the Patriot Act, we would be raked over the international moral coals. But I, as a Jew, dare not use the lowest common denominator as a yardstick to measure my behavior or justify my actions. That King Hussein in 1970 killed 20,000 Palestinians, or that the late President Assad of Syria killed 5,000 of the Muslim Brotherhood in Hama, is not my paradigm. In fact, such comparisons are so invidious that it diminishes my own self-worth as to what I understand as a Jew. I cannot, dare not, let the brutality of the other side determine my behavior. There has to be some sort of restraint and understanding, as I said, particularly when we are threatened. And we know there are double standards. There are double standards all the time, and sometimes we Israelis feel maligned because of that. And sometimes, as was pointed out so articulately by Imam Hindi, we have to learn other people's narratives. We have to understand the sensitivity of where we come from. And it wasn't just 60 years ago that we were almost decimated, a third of the Jewish population, in the horrendous Holocaust. But even now, in my nightmares of nightmares, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night in a sweat that maybe this new Jewish state is an episode, a third Jewish commonwealth that won't last much longer than the first and the second, that really the Arab nations do want us out of the Middle East in its entirety, despite the fact it was an act of the United Nations that created a Jewish state in what was supposed to be then a Palestinian state. Maybe that is the case. Well, that narrative colors how we act and how we behave, but it can't determine actions that only contradict what we know to be our literary heritage and our historical development. There is an application of double standards that is hurled upon us over and over again. Yet when drawing comparisons, we must not exploit this double standard to excuse our actions. After all, we educated the world that the Zionist enterprise would be different, that we would be called what is known as an Or LaGoyim, a light into the nation. We call ourselves a chosen people of unusual and unmeasured quality, not as privilege, but as obligation. An obligation that we impose upon ourselves to have a society that will be that reflection of the very best of what we understand to be the prophetic idea of decency and equality. We know there's a hypocritical application of double standards, but as Jews, we must judge ourselves by a single standard. After all, if we teach our people the tactics of the enemy, will we not begin to look like and act, at least in the eyes of the others, as having assumed the face of our most despised persecutors? The belief in the dignity and sanctity of human life is rooted in universal teachings found within Judaism and given expression throughout Jewish history. Rabbi Hillel's statement that was quoted in another phrase of a Christian quote from Imam Hindi, "What is hateful to you, do not do unto others." We must not sell our souls for the presumed riches of a promised national heritage of land and glory. We cannot continue to foster a penchant for fantasy. Otherwise, the lunacy of the day before yesterday will become yesterday's exception and today's routine. And I say that knowing that there is an attempt to delegitimize the Jewish state, that we have no access and no rights, as if history in the Middle East began in 1967. And we know that, well, now that Mr. Arafat is dead, there's obituaries. He was not born in Jerusalem as he claimed in the end. He was born in Cairo. He was not the first Yevusi, the Jebusite who was in the land at the time of the conquest. There's a whole reading of history that has to have some sort of objectivity to it, and we would be wrong, I as a Jew would be wrong not to say that I don't have my legitimate rights to Israel and the Jewish state. I'll put it, instead of quoting all the historical documents, that there was always a Jewish presence in the land until the very inception of the third state in 1948. In 1986 and 87, I came on a sabbatical to the United States of America with my family. And my wife, and that time we had 3 children, and we were outside of Washington, D.C. in Falls Church, Virginia. And we enrolled our kids in public schools. Now, my kids were all born and raised in Israel, and my wife is a former American like myself, so we speak English at home. So their spoken English is absolutely fluent. Their reading and writing was a bit challenged at the time, to say the least. You know, Hebrew, by the way, is written without vowels. Well, my daughter, in the 8th grade, she wrote English without vowels. And English is if you're born in America, if you're born into an English environment, English is fine. If you don't come from that environment, English, it's an impossible language to learn. I mean, you can't spell the language. S-H-O-O-T is shoot, but F-O-O-T is foot. Well, why isn't it foot and shoot? You know, who can spell xenophobia? I mean, it's an impossible, and idiomatic English, not on our radar screen. I remember my daughter was having trouble in school, and the teacher said, "Liat, if you have some difficulties, you tell your parents to give me a buzz." She said, "I'm not sure we have one of those at home." My oldest daughter, it's true, the teacher, not my oldest daughter, my youngest daughter, the teacher said, "Now bundle up." She was in 1st grade. "Bundle up, kids. It's raining cats and dogs." She was petrified. She was going to be hit by some foreign animal. So what was the curriculum for the 7th grade class? Colonial American history. Well, having been born and raised in Israel, she didn't know anything about pilgrims and Native Americans, but we're in Falls Church, Virginia, not far from Williamsburg, the colonial times. So I said, let's go there. It brings the history alive. So we went there. It was a Sunday afternoon. Went to a place, I think it's called Carter's Grove or Carter's Plantation. I forget what the name of it. We're an eclectic touring group, about 40 different people. We go into this colonial mansion. The tour guide is dressed in colonial garb to fit the mood of the times. And all of a sudden, she turns to us while we're sitting in the living room of this mansion. She drops her voice down, and she says, "In a few minutes, we're going to go out the back door of this mansion, and we're going to see an ancient village." And everyone sort of oohs and ahs, what could you be talking about? And then she really lowered her voice to a whisper to draw us into the drama. She said, "Does anyone have any idea how old that village might be?" No one said anything. Then with a bit of pride, she said, "It's an 18th, 17th, 19th, I forget, century pilgrim enclave." And then with full confidence, she asked the question she should never have asked. She said, "Has anyone in this room seen anything older than that. Americans are very egocentric, I think. My daughter's hand dashed right up. She said, well, where I live, my father and I sometimes take hikes to visit the gravesite of Samuel the prophet, who anointed Saul and David kings over Israel. And then she paused very dramatically and lowered her voice and said, I believe it's about 3,500 years ago. She said, thanks, little girl. For us Jews, Israel is older than 3,500 years. Since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era by the Roman Empire, we faced Jerusalem 3 times a day and prayed for physical and spiritual return. At the close of the most important theological holiday in the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and at the close of the most important historical holiday in the Jewish calendar, Passover, that celebrates the Exodus, which we're going to be commemorating already this Saturday evening, we recite the words next year in Jerusalem. And 3 days ago on Saturday evening, I was at a Jewish wedding. At the very end of the wedding, what does the couple recite? The 137th Psalm. If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I don't place you, Jerusalem, among my greatest joys. And when we take out our Torah that catalogs our beliefs, our values, our history, we recite the words, out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. To say that we have no claims upon Jerusalem is intellectually dishonest. As far as I'm concerned, we're the longest living national liberation movement in human history. And the very fact that we held on to this dream of ultimate return has fended off exiles and crusades and inquisitions. And we know that people oftentimes do pervert God and wage war in the name of God, as the crusade certainly was the case. But this desire had fended off the crusades, inquisitions, and Cossacks and Tsars and Nazis and Arab armies and terrorists. No one could suppress the will of the Jewish people to gain its national expression in its own homeland. But having said that, because of our history, would we dare not permit other people, Christians and Muslims, and honor their emotional, spiritual, and historical attachments? If our history has taught us anything, we know that if no one could suppress the will of the Jewish people to gain its national expression in its own homeland, we must not and dare not and should not suppress the will of another people to gain their national expression in their own homeland. Which simply means, and the sad thing is everyone knows what the ultimate agreement is going to look like based on the Clinton proposal, which simply means there has to be 2 lands for 2 people, with a division even of the most sacred capital city within the historical realities of the Jewish people, and that is Jerusalem. If we're told anything, if our lesson tells us anything, no matter how besieged and threatened we feel we are, and no matter what our psychological framework is, not just in terms of what happened 60 years ago in Europe, but also what we sense could even happen tomorrow within the Middle East. After all, America waged a war against Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf in 1991, but we were the ones who absorbed the Scuds. We were in the sealed rooms, not people who were in Moscow, Idaho, and Boise, Idaho, or wherever else it might be. And so despite that, we can't let that color our behavior. Otherwise, we will undermine the very face of what we understand we are supposed to do in a Jewish state, to be what was known as a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, of concern for the other, the concern for equality. And so therefore we can't have Jerusalem built in such a way that people don't have the access that they so desperately need, that was denied to us from 1948 to 1967 against all the international conventions when it was occupied by Jordan, the West Bank. We were denied. We cannot do and replicate that sort of denial for someone else. Otherwise, it demeans who we are, apart from depriving people of the most elemental, important human rights. And we had a remarkable decision by Israel's Supreme Court. I can't imagine any other democracy in the world that would come out under the circumstances and the difficulties we face with such an incredible ruling. Forget what the International Hague said. As far as we're concerned, it was unbalanced, didn't even mention the word terrorism. It talked about the wall, the fence, which was not created in a vacuum. It came about because we were afraid to go anywhere. And so what happens? They came out with a ruling that was remarkable. The ruling said that we judges, this is the epilogue, to paraphrase it, we judges sit in an ivory tower. However, we are part of the landscape of Israel. There's no one on this court who has not lost family or friends to the horrible scourge of terror. But having said that, in defense of our own security, we dare not and must not. It is illegal, not to mention immoral, illegal, in defense of our security to grievously deny the most elemental human rights of another people. And they articulated what they were: expropriation of lands, depriving them of economic viability, social services, educational opportunities, free travel, assembly, and medical services. And ordered the government to redirect the wall. And to Ariel Sharon's credit, and you will not get me to say a lot of positive things about him, not that I want to indicate what my political leanings are, he not only made sure the army started to redirect the fence, but said we should examine other routes of the fence to make sure keeps in the spirit of the law. And I suspect, because there's so many petitions before the High Court, that the fence eventually will follow a route that will not expropriate any lands but the routes of 1967. And the truth of the matter is, terrorism has decreased because of the security fence, which is not a wall, in the north of the country, which follows the 1967 border. And anyone who says security has not been decreased because of it is living in a naive world. The hope is the fence will never have to be. That as a peace accord, we can tear down the walls that divide us, instead have open access that will unite us. Clearly, that is the hope. But that decision is a critical decision as far as I can understand. I'm proud to say that Rabbis for Human Rights was one of the petitioners with a number of Palestinians, human rights groups, to the High Court to have this remarkable decision taken under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Ultimately, we understand. And I think that, believe it or not, Mr. Sharon may understand this at the most incipient stages. And as I was articulating to someone else before, I really believe in the positive value of understanding Jewish texts and understanding personalities. You know the story that it was mentioned here, that Sarah was barren and she couldn't have a child, so she told Abraham, so there'd be some sort of future of the people, that he should have intimate relations with Hagar, the handmaiden, and Ishmael was born, the father of the Arab nations. And later, at the age of 99, which means there's hope for all of us, I suspect, she gives birth to Isaac, and Sarah orders Abraham to get rid of Ishmael. It's unfair, shouldn't have been the case. And when Abraham turns to God and says, hey, what's going on here? God said, you know what, you need a little quiet in your house. Do as your wife says. Get rid of him. So the rabbis knew it was unjust, so they redid history, and they said he was really a rotten kid, basically, deceptive and not very good. And there he is starving in the desert. God sees him, and God gives him water to survive. And the rabbis ask, why is it? He says, because the text says, Ba'asher Husham, where he is at. At that moment, he was innocent. Forget what his historical baggage was. At this particular moment, I'm putting aside the historical baggage of Mr. Sharon and trying to stress the positive, redeeming elements that could perhaps spur us on to something that hopefully will crown us with an accommodation and maybe eventual peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And so therefore, we need to find an element of compromise. And by the way, it's not justice. Justice is a very difficult word to deal with because everybody claims justice on their own side. There's a very popular song in Israel now by an Israeli rap singer. Now, I like all sorts of music. I don't like rap music. You can imagine, by the way, what it sounds like in Hebrew with a guttural chet in the ayin. It's not singing, it's gagging. It's and the students love it. The kids love it. It says everyone talks about peace, but no one talks about justice. Well, it's not justice. It's compromise. Everyone has justice on their side. If you took a pro-Palestinian professor and a pro-Israeli professor teaching a course in the Middle East, you'd have no idea they were talking about the same subject matter. It's a story of a client who orders a one-armed lawyer to litigate his case. They go to court and they win the case, and the lawyer turns to the client and says, why did you hire me? It has nothing to do with disability or personal injury. I don't understand it. The client said, because I'm sick and tired of those lawyers who say on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. I mean, that's what we have in the Middle East. On the one hand, there's justice with us. On the other hand, there's justice with us. Everyone has justice on their own side. It's compromise. And the only compromise that I can possibly understand can work. And sometimes there's a practical intercession between political decisions and morality. And someone said this earlier, that every political decision has its moral equation. And at our best, I would like to believe that our politics has an ethical root to it, at our very best. And this intercession is critical. So there may be practical reasons that Sharon wants to do what he wants to do, but the moral benefits are tremendous, not just in terms of some of the more horrible things we've done to Palestinians, but also in terms of what we've done to ourselves. There are benefits that are of great consequence. So when Israel said there will be no more demolitions of terrorist homes because it's counterproductive, didn't have to be a genius to figure that one out. That's counterproductive. Well, I argued against it on moral terms, but there's an intersection, and I will claim the moral high ground. I'll make them look better in their own eyes than they may have wanted for themselves. And so we have to have some sort of compromise between the two sides. And the compromise is to live, Israelis have to live free from fear. Not just the great psychological fear we have, but the practical fear of everyday life. But we can only live free from fear if Palestinians live free from occupation. And that does not mean that terrorism will go away if peace comes out tomorrow. Unfortunately, in the world that we live into, everyone who has a grievance can blow up a train in Madrid or carry out other dastardly acts, whether it's against an abortion clinic in the middle of this country. Everyone has their grievance. It's the sad reality that we live in. There's been a legitimization of terror in ways that are unacceptable. And unfortunately, some of us in the religious world do not speak out with a singular voice and condemn this, not for practical terms, but on moral terms. What does it mean to live free from fear? Well, I'll give some examples. At the very outset of this intifada, Israelis didn't go out very much. As resilient as we are, we didn't go out very much. We often stayed at home. I remember after about 5 weeks staying at home, my wife, she turned to me and said, David, you know what, I want to go to a movie. So I turned to her with serious, actual conversation. I said, Judy, you want to risk your life and go to a movie? She said, look, I'm tired of staying at home with you. She didn't quite say it like that. She said, let's go out. So I said, you know what, we'll go to the mall. Why? Because when you drive into the parking lot in the mall, they check your cars. When you walk into the mall itself, they check you again. And when you walk into the movie theater, they check you again. By the way, the movie we saw was Legally Blonde, which was not worth the risk, I can tell you that. I remember going out, this is true, going out to dinner finally after a long time going to dinner. It's true, you go into the restaurant, they check your bags, they check your cell phone. You go and we sit down, it's a true story. The waiter comes, takes our order, we order a bowl of soup, he goes back to the kitchen, brings the bowl of soup, my wife and I finish the soup, I look at her, she looks at me, we're still alive. Let's have a salad. I mean, that's how you get through the meal. But it turns on a dime. And you need a sense of humor to get through this, otherwise you can go insane because of the realities, not just Israelis, but Palestinians. It's such a difficult, tense situation, but it turns on a dime. My daughter, Orly, from the time she was in first grade, took 2 public buses across town to go to school. We don't have private buses. They take public buses. Israelis are unbelievably independent. They travel everywhere. They feel very safe about that. But when this intifada started and she turned 13 and a half years old, that was it. We said no more public buses because we were too afraid. In our neighborhood alone, in our very neighborhood alone, literally, a 2-minute walk from our house, 2 buses blew up and killed numerous innocents. So we took her everywhere, and believe me, that was hard. She was also in a house all the time. By the way, having an adolescent in your home is a form of terror that no one really talks about, but it is a challenge without question for her and for us. So we took her everywhere. We'd take her in the morning to school. She'd, come back from a friend's house at midnight. We'd have to, pick her up and bring her home. She finally got her license. Now, that's one of the most fearful moments in the life of a parent when your child gets a license. They have a weapon in their hand. And Israelis are known for being excessive drivers, to say the least. So we were nervous wrecks. You would think we'd be nervous wrecks, but we were thrilled. For us, it meant liberation, and liberation for her. She could go places. So we went to the Registry of Motor Vehicles to pick up her license. She goes in to get her license. She gets in the car. I turned to her. I said, Orly, do you want to drive to school? She's tears streaming down her eyes. And I knew why. 3 weeks before, one of her closest friends went to the Registry of Motor Vehicles to pick up his license, hopped on a bus, went to school. The bus blew up, and he was killed. I saw her not at the beginning of this intifada, going through our photograph albums. It's a hard story to recount. Taking pictures of herself. And I said, what are you doing, Orly? You know how we were younger, we used to trade, baseball cards? He said, well, we tell our friends which picture we would like them to pick should we be killed in a terrorist attack and would appear in the newspaper. That's a fear that we should not have to live with. But at the same time, my good Palestinian friend by the name of Ra'id Awina should not have to strap his 75-year-old father on a donkey to go around the hills of his village that has been blockaded by the Israeli army for punitive reasons. I can't think of any security reason. They just have not gotten around to remove the blockades into the main road. He should not have to strap his 75-year-old father on a donkey to go around the hills to avoid the Israeli roadblocks to get down to the main road, to flag down a taxi cab to take him to the hospital in Nablus for his weekly dialysis treatment, without which he surely would die. He should not have a situation that the security fence in that neighborhood, which happens to be necessary because there was lots of violence that came out of there, but it still is supposed to be open so people can go back and forth to school. But that day, the Army, maybe the two guys were supposed to open it, just stayed a little too long for their coffee. And so his young 10-year-old son, it took him 2.5 hours to get back and forth rather than 10 minutes. We have to live free from fear, and Palestinians have to live free from occupation. And the only way to do that is to have ultimate compromise. And I'm hoping, without being unrealistic and not being Pollyannish, that reality has seeped through to both the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. And as was said so articulately by Reverend Gerber, people have to say enough is enough on both sides. We can't tolerate it anymore. We simply can't tolerate it anymore. And one of the reasons that Sharon is doing this, I don't think he cares about the human rights of Palestinians. I don't think he gives a damn. He cares about demography, he cares about security, but I'll tell you what he does care about is the moral integrity of us Jews. And so when a year and a half ago, 2 Israeli women soldiers were killed in Gaza, the parents got on TV and pointed the finger at the Prime Minister of Israel and said, "Our daughters died in vain." Can you imagine saying that, a parent saying that? If you lose your parent, you've lost your past. You lose a child, you've lost your future. And once I was in the Gaza Strip and a reserve soldier, when there was prefabricated homes in a settlement called Eli Sinai. There was about 10 prefabricated homes, 12 prefabricated homes, maybe 60 settlers altogether. It was over Passover. For the night of the Seder, where we read the story of Passover, every single one of those families, without exception, packed up their bags and went back to Israel proper to celebrate the Seder. For 48 hours, 50 soldiers in a sea of 1.5 million hostile Palestinians were defending absolutely no one. That is morally unacceptable. And so even if the morality is inward and selfishly motivated, it still can have practical consequences for another people who suffer under occupation, no matter how benign it is and know how much better it is that we do than others, and I really believe that we do comparatively better than others, but still not enough to satisfy what I understand what is necessary. And so therefore this compromise is necessary, and perhaps now in the new era, where we don't have the extremism that Arafat did represent. And if you talk to my Palestinian friends, they did not speak against Arafat during the time he was in rule because they were afraid to. But there's not much love lost because there's new energy and new hope. There's a new sense that maybe something will come about. And if it does go smoothly, if there is a transition, then maybe Israelis will have confidence that we can go to the second stage and Palestinians won't have to worry about a civil war. And of course, if there's intervention in a positive way by the Bush administration, then maybe we will be pushed to do things that we might hold back, and the Palestinians can reform their society in ways that will also build confidence between the two people. Compromise is ultimately what's necessary, but for those of us who live within the land of Israel, we know we must defend ourselves. We know the physical realities that we live with, and we know the dangers of the world that we live in, and we know that the Iranian nuclear capabilities are a greater threat to us than they are to you because we experienced it in our own flesh during the first Gulf War. With the Persian Gulf. We knew what it was like. And so therefore we know that we have to embrace the personage of Joshua, the great conqueror. But we also know that at the same time that there was Joshua, there was Amos, the great prophet who spoke of accommodation. We know that David the warrior is critical for our survival, but we also know that David wrote Psalms of peace. And we know that we had those great heroes who went to the heights of Masada to fend off the Roman invasion in order to protect themselves, committing suicide, an extreme zealous act. But we also know at the same time there were those Jews who went to another town called Yavna and built houses of learning that spoke about tolerance and accommodation. We have to have this balance between a priestly understanding of our Jewish history and our prophetic understanding. Ultimately, we Jews understand that. And Imam Hindi spoke about fasting as a means of atonement and of self-sacrifice. Well, on the Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur, our most sacred day, we fast. We fast not just for self-deprivation, but we're told by the prophet Isaiah what the fast means. Is this not the fast I look for, says God? To unlock the shackles of injustice, to undo the fetters of bondage, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every cruel chain. If you remove the chains of oppression, the menacing hand, the malicious word, then shall your light shine in the darkness. And our rabbis taught us, who is mighty, who is the hero? The one who turns an enemy into a friend. And the Talmud tells us the world rests on three pillars: on truth, and on respect, and on peace. And the three are one. For when truth is proclaimed, respect is accorded, and peace is established. Allahu inta salam, minka salam, Adonai shalom, b'cheinu b'shalom. May God grant us peace. Thank you.
We'll take time for questions now.
Yeah, way in the back. Stand up.
How do Israelis feel towards the United States and Israel? What is the feel of the United States?
Well, I'm not so thrilled that we have Sparrows, McDonald's, Blockbuster, and all these other intrusions into our country. That fast food is we're a slower-paced country. Israel's good friend is America. The question is, what type of friend are they? We need to have truth spoken on both sides. And if Israel is behaving in ways that America finds contradictory, then they should speak out. The challenge America has right now is that Israel is going to easily turn the tide and say, hey, if you were living what we were living with, your Patriot Act would be far more severe. But it's clear to me that Israelis, it's very mixed. As I said, things are complex. Israelis were very much in favor of the war for visceral reasons. We wanted Saddam Hussein out because we suffered sitting in those sealed rooms for 6 weeks, which is one of the most... Well, I'll give you an example. My oldest daughter had just come back from a school trip to Poland where she visited the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The day after she returned, she entered the sealed room with our family to face another threat of gas. So the visceral reactions are very great. But now that it's after the fact, and I mentioned that there's no secrets, Israelis are a nervous wreck. Why? Because there's an open border between Jordan and Iraq. And Ehud Barak was prepared to give back the entire Jordan Valley to the Palestinians. The first nation to oppose this return was Jordan. They didn't want Palestinians on their border because 70% of Jordan is Palestinian, and that's why he went to war in 1970 to get rid of the Palestinians and push them into Lebanon because he was afraid he would be overthrown. And because it's a monarchy which is weak and operates by dictatorship as any monarchy would be, as enlightened as it might seem, the fact is it's a monarchy. And so now we have grave doubts about that war because if the border is open and infiltration of arms come in and Jordan is destabilized, then we will have these weapons of immediate destruction literally next door to Israel. So I'd say we have mixed feelings. At the same time, we also admire America as being a creative, open society, although this is on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we're critical of Israel in terms of its lack of pluralism. That is to say, if you took Israeli media and see how they treat what we are doing in the Palestinian Authority, you'd find that it's unbelievably open and critical. You can go into any one of the major newspaper of Israel, which is called Haaretz. If you go into the website, you will be astounded at some of the stuff that criticizes Israelis' incredible behavior in all sorts of areas. I don't see that same sort of critical media in the print or in the news. We show the most horrific things that we are doing to Palestinians. I don't see that within the American media. And so even though we appreciate it, we wish that they operated with the same openness and criticism and moral concerns for what they're doing before they come after us. Yeah.
You warned against religious nationalism, but then you eloquently evoked religious tradition to talk about the need for human rights and protection and working towards peace. So it seems, how do you balance that? Because on one hand you suggest religion was a source of conflict, and we need to remove the religious factor in order to create peace. But then you obviously evoke religion to suggest how we can work with it.
That's because when I invoke it, it's right. No, I don't think there's a contradiction here. My concern was the fusion of religion and nationalism. I try to speak out of a religious tradition that doesn't talk about a nationalist understanding, because if you have a nationalist understanding, it becomes very parochial. And as was so articulated beautifully by both Imam Hindi and Reverend Gerber, it means you have to accept other people's narratives. And if you have a fundamentalist approach, you don't accept the other narrative. What you do is divinely inspired, and anything is permissible. And when that happens, there's no room. As a matter of fact, you exist in order to destroy what you think is the evil of the other side, without standing in their place in any real way. And too often, religion is used as another weapon in the national arsenal. And a group like Rabbis for Human Rights speaks out with a voice that is not parochial and nationalistic, but universal, that talks about the other, even on the most difficult times. So I don't find that to be contradictory. The challenge I have is the ecstatic right-wing religious individuals who are not open to any sort of dialogue. And dialogue is ultimately what will bring to some sort of mutual understanding. So the voice of an organization like Rabbis for Human Rights is critical, as far as I'm concerned, in my own reality. But there are challenges. We used to have a very, very extensive dialogue with Christians and Muslims. It ended after the Second Intifada, to the point that I participated in a conversation, an international conference in Dakar, Senegal, on Africa and the question of Israel/Palestine. And I was to give a presentation on, there was the head of the Catholic Archdiocese in East Jerusalem, the head of the chief preacher of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Akrima Sabri, who is now the head of the Waqf, all the religious institutions within East Jerusalem for the Muslims, and myself representing Judaism, to talk about Jerusalem, the holy city of three religions. And I prepared a very accommodating speech of sharing, and the first speaker was the Catholic priest, who was a wonderful speech. Akrima Sabri got up, and he recited, and this was in the euphoria of Oslo, it was just right after Oslo was declared, he recited what basically was the protocols of the elders of Zion, the medieval blood libel against Jews, a vituperative anti-Semitic talk. And it was based on his national understanding of land having absolute possession for him and for nobody else. And that sort of nationalism is what has to be undermined, and show that is not the authentic voice that has a universal understanding of human rights, that is part and parcel, and you heard it both from Reverend Gerber and from Imam Hindi, and you heard it from me. As a matter of fact, some of the texts that we quoted were variations of the same theme, but out of our own religious texts. So I don't find it. I do find one curiosity in Israel right now. If there is venom that comes out of some of the mosques against Jews, the sad thing is the venom that comes out of some of our synagogues amongst extreme Orthodox are also against Jews, because they don't want us to give up the land, so they attack us. I said, what do we need you attacking us for? There's enough people out there. It's an irony of the whole thing. I mean, that's irony. And as I said, that's what a religious Jew, an Orthodox believing Jew, is who cut down Yitzhak Rabin. And I don't want another one being motivated to cut down Ariel Sharon, even though I disagree with some of his policies, but that would be irrelevant. I don't want someone to do that sort of thing in the name of God and nationalism. Yeah, back here. Yeah, well, I think that's part of the motivation for getting out of Gaza, is we want two separate states. We don't want a situation. I mean, if we have a situation that we're absorbing Palestinians within Israel, we have to give them full political and civil rights. And it's so ironic that those Orthodox Jews who say the whole land was promised to us in Genesis 12 to Abraham, the whole land, and they say they're preserving the Jewish state, to me they'll undermine the Jewish state, unless, again, they do something that Torah Judaism would overrule democracy. For me, we can only call ourselves a Jewish state if we are democratic, and we are Jewish. So the hope is there'll be two separate states with a majority of population of Palestinians being Palestinian, and the Jewish state. Right now, Israel is about 18% of the population is not Jewish, with full political rights, and it should be that way. There is a parity that is problematic. One of the problematics are that even in all the accords, it has been made clear by the Palestinian Authority that no Jew can live in a Palestinian state. Well, why should that Palestinian state be Judenreich? Why should it be free of Jews? There's no reason it shouldn't be free. There's no reason it should be. They should have the same rights extended to them as we extend to Israeli Arabs. But the hope is when the borders are finally drawn, and as I said, everybody knows what it's going to look like. I wish we could just get there rather than killing each other in the meantime, which is two separate states where the vast majority of Palestinians are Palestinians and the vast majority of Israelis are are Jews with respect for minorities, just like Palestinians will have respect for the Muslim majority, have respect for the Christian minority. And so therefore there won't be a demographic issue if we can get to the Clinton Accords. And I wish Bush would appoint Clinton as a negotiator, if you want the truth. He has a tremendous power of, well, we know about his power of persuasion, but in this case he can, I don't think there's a Jewish mother in Israel who would welcome him, but that's another story altogether. He still devised a plan that was probably the most equitable plan. Nobody is going to get everything they want, for certain. That's the reality. And in the marketplace, we are sometimes better revealing our aces at the beginning and rather at the end, presenting those non-negotiable demands by which we cannot come to a peace agreement. You know what? We'll find out we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us, without question. Yeah, there was a question over here, yeah.
How do you see the Gaza pullout playing out? Kind of, do you think there's going to be a conflict between, are the settlers going to take action, and if they, some of them, their action matches their rhetoric? And also, do you see Egypt playing a role in assisting the pullout of the Gaza?
Yeah, it's not wrestling by bailiwick. It's a political issue. But as I said, everything is very personal. There's about 50,000 soldiers are going to have to remove these 9,000 settlers. And it's going to be a standing army. So they already have what's known as Tzav Shmona, an emergency call-up of reserve soldiers. I'm beyond that age. Also, I think, given my army record, they probably do more damage than good anyway. My son-in-law was called up to reserves. He's not going to be taking people out of the engagement, but he has to go into Hebron, which is not the safest place in the world to be. And his wife, my daughter, is a medic. Well, she's never had to do reserve duty, but they expect that there could be lots of minor injuries, and they may have to call up, the medic, which means that my wife and I will be on call to babysit our 2 grandchildren all the time. I think it's not going to be quite as dramatic as people make it out to be. I think there's a hype in the media. And I must tell you, I have some sympathy for these settlers. Not that I think they should have gone there, but they were encouraged to go there by every single Israeli government, the left or the right. These settlements were not founded in the middle of the night illegally. And they're being asked to uproot 25 years, including the graves of so many of their family members, for what I consider a greater good. And that is the beginning of a process that may crown all of us with peace, Palestinians and Israelis. How they're going to do it, I don't know. I think there will be some extremes within Israelis, not from Gaza, by the way, coming from the West Bank, some of the more ecstatic members of the other religious community who might disrupt it because they have failed to stop the democratic political process. And so therefore, there's the only way they can turn back is taking it off the streets, but that will only spur Israelis on to say we're going to do it. So the disengagement is not going to stop. It will not be easy, but it's not just dependent upon us. If, when the disengagement finally takes place and it's finished, if the Palestinian Authority can't extend control of Gaza and instead we see jihadists on the top, masked on top of Israeli homes that have been vacated, shooting the Kalashnikov rifles in the air, it'll be a tremendous psychological blow to us in Israel, but it means that there may be a beginning of an ensuing civil war between Palestinians, and also none of us will have the confidence to move to the second state. So it's going to take an awful lot of delicacy and a lot of compromise and a lot of give and take in order to make this go smoothly. It's not dependent on one side or the other. Also, Europeans and Americans are going to take a role in how you take the infrastructures and make sure they're transferred in a reasonable bureaucratic way to the Palestinians rather than being destroyed or claimed by one Palestinian faction over another. So it's a very complicated business. I can't quite figure out. There's a wonderful Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I'm convinced it's more applicable to Israel and Palestine than it is the entire Asian Peninsula. It's such a complex reality that it's very, very, very difficult to handle. Yeah. Stand up. Then you allow me the possibility to, if I don't like your question, to tell everyone another question I want to answer. Go ahead. Yeah, but unlike you, I never went through one. Go ahead. give quarters?
C-U-R-T-E-S. And fourth of us felt extremely marginalized. Kind of like the way about the Jewish identity. There was a newcomer from the students. They really can put UNC access. Which later on, Ben-Gurion, in his biography, there was a best Jewish prophet. I think he said that in his biography. And something like that. But in the Israeli land, right now, the map of Eretz Israel, Israel.
Well, there's also a map of the power in the Gaza of all of Palestine being Israel too.
There are some of the problems in terms of coexistence, but yet the steps that one took are something. It does not seem to be moving toward coexistence or dispensing of the steps.
All right, so let me get to the. I just want to answer the question so I get to an answer, so I understand where you're driving.
Let me mention, I subscribe to the Jewish Voice for Peace, Center Money, Jewish Against Occupation. So I'm pro-peace. It's not pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, I'm pro-peace. This is what this forum is all about. How do you see that happening? There's a camouflaging of so many things.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. The reason why I just wanted to get, I understand exactly what you're saying. And by the way, the Jewish Voice of Peace we work with intimately, and as the Rabbis for Human Rights, and I think that most countries should support those institutions and organizations and movements that are pushing forth for the type of world that we would like to see that will crown everyone with peace. There are contradictions within Israeli society, without question. Like they say the Israeli family sitting around the table speaks with one voice. It's the voice of everyone talking at once. I mean, that's the harsh reality that we live with. Thankfully, we have a democratic process, and we also have a judicial process that is probably one of the best in the world. Why? Because no judge is appointed politically, and they don't run. It's a professional appointments. You want to become a judge in Israel, it's jurists, academicians, and lawyers who appoint you, and the only politicians is one from the major party. They have to have a legal background. So because of that court system, we can see now, despite the fact that there are terribly contradictory voices about settlement and all the things that you mentioned, we have a court that says, you know what, there's limits to what you can do. And hopefully that will seize the day. I happen to think the greatest vibrancy of Israel is these varied views. I don't like the American system, which really is, if you're not in power, that's it. If you have, here we have coalition building, which means you have to listen to the other people. There has to be compromises. And I think that's the great strength of parliamentary democracy, particularly in the state that I live in. But in your essential comments, I agree with. I think that I'd like to jumpstart everything and get to the point that we have an agreement that doesn't have to worry about any more settlements and worry about occupation, that there are two states, one Palestinian and one Jewish, and walls will come tumbling down, and the Middle East could be a great center with Jordan, Egypt, Palestine, and Israel working together for some sort of democratic understanding of what will be the best of what I consider Jewish value heritage, what would be best in the spirit of the highest of the moral principles of each of the religions that govern too much of what happens in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
There are handouts outside from Rabbis of Human Rights if you want to pick them out on your way out. And we hope to see you this evening at 7:30 and tomorrow evening. Thank you very much.